Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of All Things Investigations. I'm absolutely thrilled today as we have double trouble. Jeff Nielsen and Jan Dunin Wasowicz or thereabouts. And we're going to talk about some trade sanctions, but really look at it from a much broader than simply U.S. perspective. So, gentlemen, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking time to visit with me today.
Glad to be here.
Pleasure to be with you.
Jeff, as our guest, could you tell us, introduce yourself to our audience, tell us a little bit about your professional background and your current role?
Yeah, sure. My name's Jeff Nielsen. As you can tell, an American lawyer, though I'm sitting here in Copenhagen, Denmark. I practiced US sanctions and European Union sanctions and export controls in the States for several years before moving to Denmark back in around 2013. Since then I was at law firms, and since then I've been in-house here in Denmark at financial institutions, working in the shipping industry. And now I'm at a large Danish engineering firm dealing with both US and, as I mentioned, European Union sanctions and export controls.
And Jan, could you reintroduce yourself to our audience, having been on the pod before?
Sure, and it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks, Jeff, for joining the program with us today. So I'm Jan Dunin Wasowicz. I'm a partner at Hughes Hubbard Reed, where I am the co-chair of the firm's Sanctions Export Controls and AML practice group. Operate out of the Paris office, but with a global practice.
So, Jeff, how did you get into trade sanctions?
That's a good story. Actually, when I was an undergrad in college in Los Angeles at USC, I was a foreign policy major, and I actually hated lawyers in law school. And I then went to Washington, D.C. and worked for the U.S. Congress for a few years, and I focused on foreign policy in Congress. I was with the House Intelligence Committee for a large part of my stay there, and I got really into foreign policy itself. I was thinking of actually going to graduate school for foreign policy. And I met some lawyers who worked on the Hill and in the intelligence community, and they convinced me, brainwashed me, I guess you would say, to becoming a lawyer. And this is one of the subjects, obviously, at least in private practice, that's closest to foreign policy. So I get to do both, be a lawyer and, of course, play in the foreign policy arena at the same time. That's how I got into the field.
Jeff, one of the things that intrigues me and has intrigued me the most about this area is that it really demonstrates a nonpartisan continuation across multiple administrations. And I say that to introduce, under the Trump administration, there would seem to be a huge jump in the amount of sanctions, and literally to the point where I would call people in the morning and say, "What's new this morning?" as opposed to the afternoon, which was "What's new this afternoon?" And sometimes it was both. But it was an incredibly dynamic era. And I'm not sure we have that much change under the Biden administration, but it certainly continued. So I wanted to start with a question of, certainly starting with the Trump administration. Literally, how did you keep up with the ever evolving world of trade sanctions and export control?
I'd actually say that it's more of a challenge keeping up now than it was under the Trump administration. I mean, the Trump administration is famous for revocation of the JCPOA and the re-entrenchment of full sanctions against Iran. That itself is actually fairly easy to keep up with. It's, in fact, in my opinion, and I would love to hear Jan's thought on this as well, more difficult significantly to keep with the sanctions on Russia, not only because the US is at it full force, but as we're going to talk about, I think here shortly, the European Union has jumped on board. So one in this field as a lawyer has to follow both US sanctions and European Union sanctions now, and all of the FAQs that come out, the enforcement actions, and of course the iterations, or you call them the packages here in the European Union, of additionally more and more sanctions that come. So I think in short, it's very difficult now to follow up or to at least keep pace with it relative to the way that it was in the relatively calm years of the Trump administration.
Jan, what about your perspective from the private practice or outside counsel perspective?
That's a great question, and I think it's always important to take a step back and think a little bit about the broader context, because obviously we could discuss the Trump administration and that administration's approach to sanctions and export controls, but you can't lose sight of the environment, the global environment in which that administration was operating. And as Jeff has said, since the world has really changed, and I think Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine prompted a number of significant developments in the sanctions and export controls landscape, from a US perspective, of course, from an EU perspective, from a G7 or G7 plus perspective, but also from a counter sanctions perspective. Um, and so you have everything that gravitates around or is related to the war in Ukraine, but you have other conflicts and other tensions and other challenges in the world that are dealt with sanctions and export controls. And so over the years, you've seen more reasons to use sanctions and export controls, more users of sanctions and export controls, and in a global environment that just has become very fragmented. And so I think that's what makes it very difficult to keep up with the developments and the priorities. And although there may be a lot of convergence on some topics, on some conflicts, there are also some topics or issues where states and organizations proceed on a more unilateral basis. And so I think that's the complexity. And part of the complexity also, I think, is results from the fact that there's, at least what I'm perceiving or observing from a private practice perspective, is that there is a delegation from the public sector to the private sector of certain tasks and missions that traditionally are things that governments do and now become issues for the private sector. So some call it geopolitics for the C-suite, or defense and security matters in the private sector, but that just adds another layer of complexity. It's not just the environment, but it's also the role of the private sector and the role of private organizations in dealing with these foreign and national security issues. That's quite novel and extremely complex.
And we've seen the Biden administration particularly bring the private sector into at least the discussion, if not being part of the solution. They have done so in anti-corruption compliance. They have also done so in trade sanctions and economic controls. Could you explain to our audience the difference in trade sanctions and economic controls? Because we in the ABC world just tend to lump that into one category.
Right, and it's true that when you use the word compliance, it's a little bit of an umbrella term. There are so many things that have the compliance element, right? Because then we go back to the root or the basic definition of what do we understand by compliance, right? So what are you expected to comply with, or what are the compliance requirements? And to a certain extent, it's an umbrella term, right? And then when you look at some companies or private organizations, they have multiple topics under the compliance department. You could have ABC compliance, trade compliance, business and human rights compliance, because you have a compliance element in so many different areas of a business's organization. So I think one way to distinguish it is sanctions traditionally is a tool of foreign policy, and that tool, when it's being used, is translated into norms that need to be implemented by the private sector. And you have all sorts of restrictions, right? You can have restrictions on transactions, on flow of goods. Trade compliance typically refers as prohibitions on import, export, transfer, transshipment, extremely broad. But at bottom, the policy decision is the results from a decision to restrict or limit certain types of transactions in commerce or in foreign relations, for that matter, or in financial relations. And that takes the form of laws, regulations that then need to be implemented, and if they're not implemented, and enforced. And I think what we're seeing is that on some topics, there's a lot of public-private dialogue, because obviously some of these restrictions can be very impactful and very complex. And that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have, I would say, this question of where you situate this practice, right? In companies and in private practice, you could see it as a regulatory practice where you seek advice on, is this allowed, not allowed? What are the expectations? What are the requirements if you want to export certain items, and so on. But you could also see it as a compliance practice, or even now an investigations practice, when you're expected to think more about your risks, how you identify your risks, how you manage those risks, how you perform due diligence, and how you react to potential allegations or allegations of misconduct in this space. So as you can see, there's different angles and different approaches to this topic. But this has been a long answer. I don't know, Jeff, if you have any thoughts on that one. I'm
Yeah.
sure you do.
I'd only add to what Jan said in that when one thinks about the compliance field and specifically trade controls, the term you used, broadly speaking, is broken down into sanctions and export controls. There are lots of ways of looking at it. The way that I tend to try to explain it to folks when they ask me what I do for a living, or when they ask me how sanctions fits into all of this, I say, look, there are several themes that of law that are regulatory, where the government regulates conduct. And some of those themes pick up a nuance to them where business is not only the target of enforcement, but an instrument of government policy to achieve objectives. And this is where sanctions and export controls come into the field. In fact, one can also reasonably construe corruption or anti-corruption law to be similar to this. Private industry is the target of enforcement, but also the instrument of achieving an ends of government policy. And here, of course, foreign policy being, or national security and foreign policy interests being the subject matter. And of course, once you get into sanctions and export controls, Tom, you asked the question, how do you separate the two? Sanctions are sanctions. These are prohibitions on certain kinds of activity vis-a-vis certain parties or certain kinds of conduct to achieve a specific foreign policy end. Whereas export controls, of course, are prohibitions on the export or re-export or in-country transfer of certain items that are not licensed, that of course have a certain significance to the foreign policy of the country promulgating the laws. Very similar, but yet still very different.
So could I ask, follow up, Jeff, on something you talked about a little bit earlier, which is the difference in the EU and US approach? And how do you really balance those from your perspective as an in-house practitioner?
Yeah. I mean, sticking to sanctions, if we focus on that, export controls is similar to this, but with regard to sanctions, it's quite a challenge. I mean, as your listeners probably know, the United States has one uniform system of enforcement and promulgation of law when it comes to sanctions. Congress passes laws, the president promulgates executive orders that become regulations, and OFAC enforces those. The Department of Justice, of course, gets involved when it comes to criminal cases. Of course, the laws are list-based. The European Union is a similar approach. They have list-based regulations that are promulgated by the European Union and Brussels. The Commission proposes, the Council passes, and the laws become law. But where things get much more complex here, and where the true difference lies, is in that in the European Union, as we'll talk about, I believe, here shortly, all sanctions enforcement is at the state level. So imagine California and Texas being charged as independent actors with enforcing the laws promulgated by the US Congress, independent of one another. This also, of course, creates a lot of challenges, not only in the context of enforcement, but state interpretation of the laws. And the member states granting exemptions to the laws on their own for the benefit of their own economic actors. Bear in mind that what makes, in my opinion, European Union sanctions really difficult. There are lots of reasons to make it difficult, but in my opinion, the most noteworthy is that each European Union member state's economic actors compete with the others. The large Danish shipping companies compete with the larger shipping companies in France, for example. Each member state is still looking out for its own economic actors' interests when it comes to sanctions laws, the other member states. This is quite a challenge when it comes to European Union member state enforcement of law because there's a significant reluctance to do so. Whereas in the US, enforcement is uniform, based on the law, by OFAC, by the DOJ, member states enforce, and each has its own approach to enforcement that seeks to protect its own economic actors.
I proposed the question about Russian sanctions, but I want to expand it a little bit because in addition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, at least from the United States perspective, we either have a coming conflict or a major competition with China. And of course, now we have a conflict in the Middle East. How have all three of these events made each of your roles more dynamic and more challenging? You've talked about Russia. Do these other two geopolitical events also impact the work you do, both from the in-house perspective and from outside counsel perspective?
Jen, go ahead.
That's a great question. And it's a great question, not just because it's very complex in terms of the geopolitics and how governments and organizations, in the case of the European Union, are reacting. But it's also a complex question from a resource management perspective, because you may have, unfortunately, more and more conflicts and more sanctions and more export controls. In a lot of the cases, at least in the short run, you have the same resources, right? You have the same team and the same company. If you're able to have external advice, you may get a little bit more. But so you have to constantly think about, okay, do I have the Russia sanctions under control? Okay, what's happening now in the Middle East? Am I exposed there? What is my risk in China? What is the next? And you can't predict the next big crisis in the world. So the one thing, and I think we spend a lot of time, external counsel and in-house teams, thinking about uh, how do you plan and design an approach to risk assessment that's robust enough so that you can develop a basic infrastructure to manage these sanctions and trade controls risks, but at the same time, that's agile enough for you to respond to the evolution of the global landscape. Sometimes my students, they come to me and they say, "Hey, Jan, how can I get into the trade compliance space?" I say, "Start by reading the newspaper." This is very much a practice. I think this is also why in the sanctions community and export controls community, you have a lot of people who are really interested in world affairs, because this is where it all begins. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, it's now year 3, has led the EU and European companies, but not only European companies, actually. The effect and the reach of those sanctions is much broader and goes way beyond the EU, to focus a significant amount of attention. But it's also because the EU has really developed new tools and stepped up its sanctions activity. And while we're still, I think, implementing the Russia sanctions, and I think there's more to come on the EU-Russia sanctions. I think as we're speaking, there's a proposal for round 14, and we're going to have more enforcement, I think. So, and these sanctions are here to stay. I think we're starting to we're starting to see also some thinking about what could happen what would happen, or what would sanctions in response to a potential conflict in the Strait of Taiwan, how these would look like, and how would this impact the private sector in Europe and elsewhere. So part of it is identifying the risks, part of it is managing the current risks under the current data, and part of it is thinking a little bit about the future, right? And it's more of a little bit of a prospective exercise, which I think is quite fascinating, actually, in this line of work, where we are occasionally asked to think about what is our potential exposure to this and that type of scenario.
Jeff?
Absolutely. I mean, I echo 100% everything Jan said. I can only add that first, I think I want to draw out one point he made, that is that any person who's listening to this podcast who's interested in getting into this field, I highly recommend that you understand foreign affairs, and that you go so far as, if you have the time and you're very young, study foreign policy, study international relations theory, because a lot of what informs policymakers' decision making, that then of course is codified, becomes law, is based on a thorough understanding of, or it requires a thorough understanding of, foreign affairs, and of course, both current events and foreign policy theory. I can also note that one thing that came to mind while Jan was talking is the concept that, or the fact that we are in what used to be a niche field. It's growing, it's nascent, growing into adulthood. I would say this field is in its early teen years right now, maybe preteen years. And of course, in this regard, there's quite a bit of turmoil. There is a phenomenon that I like to call the first actor syndrome, prevalent throughout industry. I'm sure Jan sees it with his clients. I see it in private industry, where companies, particularly here in Europe, have not historically taken this subject very seriously. Even in the US, there was a time back when I first began practicing, many companies didn't take much of the sanctions, except for Iran and Cuba, seriously. And that's changing, but still it's happening in fits and starts. And the first actor syndrome, my theory is that many companies simply don't want to be the first to do something. They don't want to be first to stick their neck out and change their business practices and perhaps kill business for the sake of complying. Of course, that plays into Jan's point regarding resources as well. We are definitely in a resource challenged field, where people like Jan and I and our colleagues have a lot to do, a lot on our plates. to keep up with both the changes of law and now the coming likely steep incline in enforcement, while at the same time trying to convince the folks who we're interacting with this is actually very serious. There's a lot at play here. It's very dynamic. And I think that 20 years from now, this field will be much more mature, but we are certainly in what I would call a revolutionary phase.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I wanted to thank you both again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely.
Our pleasure.